And I'm here with Deborah Howes. Deborah is president of House Studio Inc. and also a professor in the Museum Studies program at Johns Hopkins University and one of our keynote speakers at the Learning Ideas Conference 2021. So delighted to have Deborah here with me today. So I think we can start, maybe just tell our audience a little bit about your background and just to give them a little bit of feel for your own background and sort of what brought you to the work that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I'm been a New Yorker for more than 2 decades, but in fact, I was born in California. And as a family, we traveled a lot, more than most families, including Africa and Asia in the 70s, which is no place that most parents would take their children. But in fact, we loved it. We lived for those trips, my brother and I, and probably was the reason that when I went to college on the East Coast, I was really drawn to the art history classes. And I think that in some ways, it it made me understand that there's more than one way to learn history, that it isn't just about reading and memorizing dates and understanding timelines, that you could learn a lot about history from decoding pictures and understanding motifs, understanding patronage of who created objects and why, how some artworks were made for political gain and some artworks were just made of creative expressions. I think that kind of rich variety really resonated with me somehow. Um, the the other thing that happened in college is that I all of a sudden became much more connected to a technology mindset. My father was an electronic engineer, and so he had all sorts of gizmos in our house, circuit boards, and we had the first Wang computer that sat on his desktop, and it had a cassette tape for a brain. I mean, all sorts of stuff. And my college, Wellesley College, had a connection to MIT. And because many of the students there didn't have that kind of upbringing that I did, they were not interested in many of the things that were offered to the Wellesley College students. For example, I learned how to use a word processor. That dates me. But that even though my family had given me this beautiful IBM Selectric as a college gift, I let my other friends do that. It was much simpler to go onto the MIT mainbrain and just type out my papers and be able to print them iteratively. So that actually helped me land my first museum job. And honestly, there was nothing magical about me going into the museum business. I'm like, okay, I got an art history degree. What do I do? Oh, I work at a museum. It really was that simple. And it's not that easy to get jobs at museums. First of all, there are not that many positions, and and I didn't have any kind of like influence or whatever. But when I told them I knew how to use a word processor at the Museum of Contemporary Art, they're like, oh, we just got one of those. Nobody knows what to do with it. So, it's been an interesting ride. And then through that process, I was working for a curator that, already if a contemporary art museum, even the painting and sculptures are kind of controversial, but I was working for the media and performing arts curator who was managing and directing and presenting all manner of crazy, out there, New York fresh performances that Los Angeles had never seen. They'd never seen anything like this. And I was like, wow, to the director who, there was only 12 of us opening this museum. But interesting that like people are like walking through the galleries and not really looking at what's on view. And he's like, oh, I don't care about education. Like art speaks for itself. And I'm like, I don't think so. Like not this art. It's abstract, it's all one color, it's made out of light bulbs. I mean, who is really ready to look at that unless, like me, you've had a background with an artist. My mother was an artist. And so that kind of led me to go back to school and get a degree in education. And I chose the school that was founded by John Dewey at the University of Chicago. Not so much because of Dewey, honestly, but because they were interested in this idea of museum education. I didn't really want to go to a museum education program. I wanted really to understand, like, okay, so how do we know people are learning in these environments? And, you know, social studies at the University of Chicago is famous for so many reasons, but one of them is that they're really good at assessment. And they themselves were interested in thinking, yeah, how can we assess learning in an informal learning environment? And that's what brought me to the Art Institute of Chicago, where I was running the evaluation program for a couple of years. We learned a lot from our visitors, some of it quite practical, but others even a little more experiential about learning. It was a really fun collection to work with. The Art Institute of Chicago is one of the best known collections. You don't even know that you know it, but American Gothic is there by Grant Wood, the two farmers and the farmer and his wife standing in front of the barn with a pitchfork. Edward Hopper Nighthawks is there, which is the night scene of the diner with the yellow light. And I didn't realize until I'd been working there for a while as an educator that, in fact, the reason people know those paintings, other than the fact that they're fantastic paintings, is that they used to be featured in a game called Masterpiece that maybe you played when you were young. I know I did. And it was a board game like, you know, Monopoly or whatever. And the point was to acquire as many paintings as possible and sell them and so on. But the collection, the Art Institute's collection provided the basis for that game. So when I was working on as a public educator, they would come to the museum with these postcards and say, can you show me this painting? You know, a little interesting thing about museums and popular culture. I feel like that focus on assessment, technology, and art is something that I'm always going back to and has really propelled a lot of my thinking and sort of the rest of my career.
Yeah, no, I'm curious. Well, how and when did technology start to fit in, right? So I know, I mean, you obviously got your first museum job because you were, you know, a word processing expert, and that helped you get a foot in the door. But in terms of how you associated that with learning in museums and got kind of into integrating those, how did that come about for you?
Oh, I wish I could say that it was all intentional. It would make me look so brilliant, wouldn't it? No. Okay, so we're in the Art Institute. It's the late 80s. I've worked as an educator there long enough to get a good handle on the collection. I'm making friends with the technology departments, which were pretty simple at the time, you know, digital images, whatever. And the director's getting these inquiries from people like, you know, Steve Jobs. I'm building a house in Seattle and I want to project images of the Art Institute of Chicago on my walls. Can we do this? And they're like, ask Deborah. She's the only one that knows how to use, like, you know, this stuff. And so I got brought in as a very young person. I got brought into these conversations. It's like, okay, how do we handle communication with Steve Jobs about a very personal use for our images? And the consensus was, he should pay for these. Like, this is going to cost us a lot of money. This is pre-digital. We don't have scanners in our museum. It would cost us a lot of money to do that. And the working back, that was like, no. And I can't say it was from him personally, but whoever was handling this inquiry, maybe the architect, was like, I'm not going to pay for it. You're a museum. You should just provide us these images. And we were really kind of like, oh, and but then we were in the age of video discs, and I don't know if you remember this, but K-12, one of the first ways that digital information was distributed through K-12 was through video discs. And you would have a special player, it looked just like a VCR, but it had a plate that came out. I mean, people still do use these for like special run movies and things like that, because in fact, the resolution on these video discs is pretty spectacular. But anyway, National Gallery, a lot of other kinds of museums were distributing through K-12 huge libraries of images. Remember, no internet, no nothing, no CD-ROM. And the Art Institute was approached by Voyager, which was one of the biggest educational publishers. They were based out of Los Angeles, and Bob Stein was the energy there. And he's like, you know, I've been making these video discs, and my 8-year-old kid, I put in front of the computer to do, you know, user testing. And he loves looking at the images. Would you, Art Institute of Chicago, be interested in making a video disc for children? And again, they're like, ask Deborah, I don't know. And so I'm like, yeah. And I mean, the things that we used to have to go through to do that, we literally rented a Hollywood studio and projected our transparencies onto a movie screen where the digital camera from Hollywood would take a picture of the analog projection. And that, my friend, was the images that we used in the video disc. That's quickly, by the time it came out, it was a CD-ROM bundled with Apple educational equipment, pulled with open eyes, and it took off. And we heard so many positive things from teachers about how important it was for those images to be part of their classroom, not just art teachers, lots of teachers. And we had built an interface that was all visual, no words. And many teachers felt like it was tremendously accessible for kids who were having trouble reading or who didn't speak English. And so, you know, those things really do impact you. It may not have been the reason we made it. We just thought it was a good idea. And this company was willing to take our hand to do it. But the outcome was exceptionally fantastic. And it was the #1 art CD-ROM for a number of years.
Well, that's fantastic. And what a process it was to get that done. Yeah, back in those days, I was also doing some work back in those days where it's, yeah, it's a little different than it was. You weren't,
Oh my
God. Not like
But
broadcasting
also,
from home as we do
yeah,
now.
but you know, the fun part was that nobody had any expectation. So anything that you did was like phenomenal.
Right, right. No, that's absolutely true. And you would, and it was also not, in a certain sense, there was more openness to creativity because nobody had a preconceived notion of what anything was going to be, right? So it was kind of like, you are, okay, go do what you do. I don't know what that's going to be. You may not know what that's going to be, but go do it. And it was really, in that sense, a wonderful time to be in, you know, kind of in the fields that we've been in, the related fields we've been in.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you sort of a, you know, broader question. You know, we've talked already about how your experience, both academically and in work, is so interdisciplinary. You've got art, you've got technology, you've got education, you know, digital analog, on and on and on. So in terms of achieving your goals, how have you found that to be both a strength and in some ways perhaps a limitation?
Yeah. So the concept of interdisciplinary, that's the base of your question. I am, I feel like if there was one thing I could say is my secret sauce, it's that. And part of it is because, you know, having an artist mother and an engineer father. But I really remember, I think, you know, going back to like, what were some early signs that this was it? When I was 16, my mom took me to San Francisco. Strange that we had gone all over the world, but never San Francisco. Anyway. And the one thing that she was really keen to go to, because many of her friends were scientists, was a museum called the Exploratorium. And you might be familiar with this museum. It's been around since the 60s. It was founded by not Frank Oppenheimer, but his brother. And this brother had become a science educator, incredibly successful science educator. And the museum is built around this concept that you learn science by hands-on, and you include all the different parts of what you can in that learning. So arts, science, history, whatever it is, like, you know, they give you a few pieces of machinery or technology, or sometimes even just light or water. And then you're guided through a series of explorations where you're like, oh, that's how a rainbow works, or whoa, that's what makes gravity. And you know, that experience really stuck with me. I can't say I analyze it and say, oh, this is a multidisciplinary experience. But I think when you look at, for example, major breakthroughs, either in science or humanities or art, it's very often because you have this combination of skills coming together. And I don't know if you know this story, again, going back to MIT, Building 20. You know the story of Building 20? That during World War II, they had to quickly build something for, the Manhattan Project. And so they threw up this 3-story shed, basically, that was supposed to only last for a few years while they figured out, where to house 20% of all the physicists in the US. They combined them in this building. And what happened after World War II is actually more interesting, which is that MIT didn't take the building down. They used it to put all these interests and research projects and study centers that were popping up left and right, and they threw them all into the building. So you had, for example, Seymour Papert, who's a huge computer educator, next to Noam Chomsky, who's a known linguist, right? And Harold Egerton, who was doing experiments with strobe photography. And, they had to like cross each other. There's no partitions. Like they just sort of occupied like areas of this dusty, breezy, forlorn building. And in that diversity, there were conversations and collaborations. And I mean, I just named a few, but like the history of Building 20 is legendary about how having an interdisciplinary environment like that really did fuel a lot of creative innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then really that I assume led to the media lab that's still around today.
Exactly.
So yes.
Exactly.
So.
And just to balance the science with the art a little bit, it's also true for the arts. And in fact, Los Angeles, where I grew up and where my mom went to art school and so on, the artists that are now quite well known and doing very well in the markets, at the time, they were not looking at the East Coast for any examples. What were they looking at? They were looking at the aerospace industry and noticing that there's all these new materials and there's paint that you can have iridescent qualities with, or there's ways to treat mirrors that allow you to look through but also have a look back. And they were making sculptures that no one had ever seen or even had a language to describe. And at the same time, especially at UCLA, they were doing all these experiments in human behavior and cognition. And they were building spaces where you couldn't hear anything, anechoic chambers. And many of the artists were like, wow, how does this alter my perception of visual space and time? And so these artists now are like, brilliant. And we look back and we think, wow, this is really a breakthrough. But it wasn't just one person. It was that they all grouped together because nobody else was paying any attention to their art. And they were embracing science.
As you talk about it, I mean, it's so easy to see and envision some of the learning experiences that we can build and that are built, sometimes designed and built today, but still sort of a minority in what's out there. And we sort of have this opportunity, and more as technology gets better and better, and we have more and more mainstream options, to continue to build experiences like this and move away from the idea of you need to learn content and facts in that sense, and that's really what has value, and into the experiences that people can have, that they'll learn in context, that they'll be emotionally tied to learning, that they'll learn in ways that they appreciate and enjoy and will pursue, and are much more individual, and all of that kind of goes along so nicely with the experiences that you've seen, which I don't know that they often get discussed as much in the context of traditional education, but they are, which I guess then leads me to asking a little bit more about your thoughts on the role of museums and what the roles that they play and could play, and really should play in public education and lifelong learning. So where do you see museums best fitting in, both now and in the future, in terms of both public education and lifelong learning?
Yeah, this morning, maybe you get this too, but I get the newsletter from the New York Times every morning, and I kind of scan it, just to make sure that, something significant hasn't happened in the world that I don't know about. And this morning, the first thing on the newsletter was, oh, clearly we need more school. It's just not enough. Right? Did you see this? Like, and I'm thinking, what? Do we decide because 12 years of schooling isn't doing the right job? Do we just add more? Like, it's just like, cool. We have to rethink what we're doing. We have to rethink why. And I think the biggest failure, in my opinion, of the current educational school system is that we don't teach people to love to learn. We teach people that learning is something you have to get over with, like that you do it for so long, you take a test and you're done. And, I think maybe this is a little bit of John Dewey coming out because he has a lot to say about lifelong learning. But museums are for those of us who love to learn. And they might even be, in many cases, for people who didn't know they loved to learn. And I think the approach that you have as a museum is, come on inside. We're going to show you a bunch of stuff. It's up to you what you see. We're not going to watch and make sure that you go into every gallery. There's no test to see what you learned when you've been in our galleries. We're not going to hold you to your experience. You're just here to be with your loved ones, absorb whatever you can. And if you want more information, we're here for you. And is what we all want for schooling. Like, I think in many ways, we've just forgotten about that. And I feel like the opportunities of museum, putting learners into control of their learning. And, this is not new for the progressive educators among us, but it still hasn't really had a big enough impact. And I think Dewey also said this, that the trend of our schools now is really about how can we use computers to assess where we are, not how can we support every kind of learner. And I think one of the interesting outcomes about this horrific unplanned experiment of just everybody going to teaching and learning from home, right? You couldn't have invented a worse way to convert to digital learning. I mean, really, you couldn't. And not to diminish the truly horrible outcomes that have evolved from that, from understanding the digital divide in a much clearer and specific way, and also just the the stress that it's caused for the teachers and the students and the families. Okay, all that. But if you look with forensic eyes, you begin to see that there's some harmonizing there among the takeaways. And one of the takeaways is, you know what? A lot of kids find it stressful, either physically challenging or emotionally challenging, to be in school every day. A lot of kids. And, the other thing is, parents don't mind actually having a little bit of insight into who their children are as learners. They also don't mind having this wonderful connection with teachers that doesn't require them to take time off work and meet with the teachers and be at the school and all of that, that they have really appreciated being able to zoom in with the educators and sort of check in to see what's going on. So lose those values as we think about creating lifelong learners. I really feel like there's a lot of incentive in this topic. And then finally, if you're I'm sorry, I'm not a neurologist, but I've been told that the key to learning, honestly, when you think about the core of learning, which is remembering, right? Like, if I learn something, I remember it, it's in my memory. Museums are fantastic memory making places. Why is that? Well, I can tell you from experience working in the public aspect of museum work that everybody has a story about coming to a museum in a field trip. And generally, it's the first time they've been to a museum, just generally. And they may not even remember what they saw, but they remember being in a place that was completely different from anything else. They remember some kind of emotion that they felt, whether it was excitement or something scary. I used to work at the Museums of Science and Industry, and how many stories did I hear about people going down into the coal mine and how scared they were. That was an exhibit there. I don't know if they still have it. It was pretty scary. And they remember like having conversations with each other about certain things. You'll go into a gallery and one of your visitors will say, "Oh, I remember being here when I was 12, you know?" And so there's so many things that if you were a neurologist, you would say, "Oh, well, okay, so how do you get this memory into your amygdala?" You know, if you have a social interaction around a thing, an idea, it's pretty much going to go right to your amygdala. Also, if you have an emotion associated with this idea, very, very good way to get stuck in your memory channels. Did you also have some kind of sensory experience? You know, museum experience is about immersion, you know, my eyes, my ears, my smell, like there's so much going on. Also, a great way to make sure that that memory doesn't go away. We don't use any of that in our current schooling, even if it is physically based. I can understand it would be hard to do all the senses if you're digital, but you know, come on, we're in a classroom. Like, how many of us really engage in all of that sensory perception? The museums, I think, have a lot to offer formal education and in sort of thinking about lifelong learning. And those of us, I think, who've had the best learning experiences also find museums to be places that they feel in control of.
Yeah, no, and I think one thing that strikes me is that that you also have real experiences and real stories, and you really, get a true feel for things that happen. Right. So when you're talking about memory, you're not talking about memorizing, what date did, on what date did this war begin and end. I mean, you certainly want to know the general time period. You may want to know the specific dates. There are reasons that those are not always unimportant things to do, but they're not all there is. In fact, they're not the most important things. Right. What was the war about? What were the different size positions? What led to people? What were the hardships that people endured? What were the things that they would have done differently, on and on and on. How does that affect society today? How does it relate to things that we might be considering? And all of those are things that can end up in your memory in a really different way when you go through the kind of experience you have in a museum, or that you can in in a high-tech online experience, certainly with some of the new technologies that we have, that are very, very different from memorizing facts and passing a test on, great, it was, this particular date in 1812, and that was a key date in the War of 1812 or whatever. And that's not, it's really, there's just not that much value to that. And that's the kind of thing that goes in and out of your head. The other thing that's always struck me over the past several years related to this is that as we have more, it feels like there's only more and more emphasis on knowing facts and on testing. And computers are really good at that, right? Like that's the part that machines do well. That's the part that is less human, right? That's,
Right.
to say, oh, I don't remember the exact date, let me look that up. I can always do that. And instead it's the stories, it's the life, it's the experiences that we have the opportunity to do. And, always looked at ways to take technology and create things that people can experience in those ways. Almost goes back to the images that you did for Steve Jobs way back. It's that kind of experience that we want to create. And to me, that always seems like where museums are doing exactly this kind of thing, and then it kind of stays a little bit too isolated, right? Like that's when you go to a museum. Well, why isn't that all the time? Right? Why isn't that part of what school is? Why isn't that what your experiences are? And there obviously are financial barriers and others, but there aren't maybe as many as we think, because things that we build, certainly on a computer, can scale up, right? So we build a great virtual reality experience. There's maybe some hardware cost right now, but other than that, you build it for one person, you could build it for a million people, right? The software is done. And certainly anything we do
100%.
online, our audience here could be one person, could be a million people. It doesn't matter. We're going to, show this interview and they can all see it, and the cost is the same essentially, other than making sure people have access, which is not insignificant, but is a much smaller, relative to what we've done. So yeah, there are really so many opportunities. And then I guess related to that, if we can talk a little bit about digital cultural resources, and I guess we're starting maybe to get close to that. How can these be best designed and employed to create effective learning experiences? So you've obviously done a lot of that. We've talked a little bit about some examples in museums. But what, how can those be best designed, and how can we best use those in education and maybe integrate them into the classroom and make this transition to a much more experience-based educational world for all just a lot less expensive and a lot easier to accomplish.
I really hope what you just said comes true. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking, what if this pandemic had happened 10 years earlier and we didn't have Zoom and we didn't have, it would have been so much more horrific, So, I mean, as bad as it was, imagine, how would we have solved that problem? I don't know. I really don't know. So yes, forward, please. We need to be thinking about forward. And I just want to, but let me just go back a little bit in time to when I arrived at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 90s, and the website of that museum consisted of a page with a very small picture someone had shot. Maybe, it was probably like a 4-bit image from their flip phone of the museum with a big yellow taxi in front of it. You could barely see the museum behind. And underneath it said, click on this to enter the museum and to register to enter to the museum. And you clicked on the button and it said, who are you? Enter your email address. And I'm like, okay, we got to change all of this. And then when you did put in your email address, it said, which floor would you like to visit? First, second, third, no pictures, no indication of what. And it's like, okay, well, UX design was not even invented at that moment, but still, like any reasonable person can understand that whoever designed this website didn't understand the first thing about what the World Wide Web really means. And fortunately, I was able to convince the director pretty quickly that we needed to take a leadership position in what museums could do online. And you have to understand how opposite this concept is to most content generators in a museum, right? The curators are about bringing objects into their building and keeping them closely guarded and safe. And their research is very much based on their own PhD or whatever interests, right? And they open it to the public as kind of like, well, it's our mission. Like we'll let the people in, but we're really about the objects. And so why on earth would they put anything on the internet that would let the objects out of their control? Who knows what people would say about them? And then second, would people come to the museum after they've seen this image online? And it has taken 20 years to get around. Every museum's at a different, stage of evolution. But basically, one of the major accomplishments while I was at the Met was creating a timeline of art history, not just of the Met, although of course, we, for the most part, it is a collection where you could illustrate a 5,000 world history timeline. But it also included objects from other collections. And it was something that the curators understood how to contribute to. They know what a timeline is. It was something that teachers knew how to use, even if they knew nothing about art history. At least they would have a date, right? Or maybe a country that they could create, because it was sort of a multi-visual timeline. You could go in through the globe, you could go in through the chronology. Anyway. And because we launched that in 2001, it had some limitations as a technological innovation, but it was the first. And being the first meant that all of the art history programs linked to it, and all of the other museums linked to it. And it became still is the most authoritative source for verifying information in terms of chronology and so on. Now, in today's world, when we're talking about decolonization, reevaluation of history, including multiple perspectives, I would never design a timeline like that. And I remember having a conversation with the director, Philippe de Montebello, saying, we could create this so that we could link to other timelines. No. And, that's another museum behavior that we really need to work beyond. Um, if you look today, and, it would take you a long time to come up with a final number, there are, I want to say, thousands of museum built resources of various quality and topics and whatever, thousands, um, all pretty much hidden in some way on their websites. So woe be the teacher who wants to find, for example, a resource that I just helped build for the Brooklyn Historical Society, now the Center for Brooklyn History, Muslims in Brooklyn, right? It's in your site, it's there. If you type the word Muslims, Brooklyn, you might find it. But basically, teachers and parents and lifelong learners, their attention span is small. And, we rely on these basic search engines that are mostly powered by forces we don't understand. And so I think that museums really need trusted partners to help them understand two things. One is, how do I organize my fantastic materials? I mean, to be honest, millions of museum records right now exist on the internet, free, beautifully illustrated. You can write an API and grab all of the best things from the top museums on your desktop if you were so smart. It's all there. It hasn't made a huge impact yet. And we need trusted partners to have the right educational motivations to say, here's something that you can do. Here's an idea of how to look at these collections in ways that really help us from a learning, teacher, education point of view. Or structure student activities in ways that allow them to be the explorers, allow them to put the information together. That I would really love to see. The second thing we need, and this is maybe more of a short-term than a long-term goal, because I think the first one is a long-term goal. It's going to evolve as the technology evolves. The short-term goal is that, by and large, museums are not really understanding how information works in the information highway. They really don't. And there has been some effort, for example, with Wikipedia, which I feel is the first rung that we could cling to, right? You probably know that, the smart speakers and AI and everything else is built around Wikidata, which powers a lot of inquiries on the web. And if you look at most museums, not just their Wikipedia entries, but the data underneath it or the Wikimedia collections, not a lot there. So they're losing their authority. Museums have one of the highest authorities. People trust museums more than newspapers. And I do worry that they aren't controlling these information sources and they're losing their authority.
Yeah, that's an interesting concern, and certainly sounds like it's a time of opportunity and a time of concern. I think both at this point, and maybe some of those could get addressed by more museum partnerships with schools would put them in a position from an earlier stage to be sort of joined with the forces of authority and knowledge, and sort of give them a position that might be just a little more a little easier to find once you can kind of get into that a little bit more. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I think getting back to one of your earlier points, I mean, the idea that learning is so often perceived as a chore, right? It is something you need to go through, you need to finish, you need to finish and pass your test, and the goal is passing the test, right? Like, the goal isn't even learning, the goal is passing the test, and it's very hard not to get obsessed with that, especially with pressures that people have today, certainly here in the US, to get the right test scores and get into the right colleges, and on and on and on from just a very young age. And there's an entire sort of cultural change that we sort of need to try to continue to bring about, and museums certainly seem to be a huge part of that. And there's such an opportunity to take what we have and make that more a part of what people do, both as an example as of learning experiences that are well designed and are experiential and in the true sense, and also as as a way to connect schools and museums and kind of get people to understand museums. So there's so much to talk about and so much there. I think it probably brings us to a good point to wrap up, and so much looking forward to your keynote at the conference, and very much appreciate the time you took today to talk with me. And there's so many interesting things we can do, and I leave this conversation more and more excited and enthused about them, and it's really great talking to you.
Thank you, David, so much. And I really look forward to the conference and hearing all the other wonderful speakers.
Thanks again.